Hi, and welcome to Local Nation. I'm Nick Marzano, and in today's episode, we're going to start at the beginning with a look at the origins of local government in America. There are almost 90,000 local governments in the United States. So, our first challenge today is going to be how do we boil down these 90,000 governments into some categories that make sense no matter where you live, no matter where you're listening? And then also, why does local government look so different from state to state and from place to place? We tend to spend a lot of our time talking about national issues and news, yet the majority of our day-to-day interactions with government are on the local level. Sometimes those experiences improve our lives, like a nice run in the park or a block party permit. My hometown of Philadelphia loves its summer block parties. And sometimes they're a little frustrating, like driving in circles looking for parking, or waiting forever for your bus, or getting pulled out of work to serve jury duty. And finally, these experiences with local government can be downright life-altering, like getting arrested and charged with a crime, or waiting anxiously for the fire department to respond to your call, or making a decision about where to send your kid to school. And so there's a lot of opportunity to make our day-to-day lives better through local government. Maybe you want to petition city council to address a dangerous intersection, or you're a small business owner who wants to put al fresco tables on the sidewalk. Or maybe you just want to be a good neighbor and sign up as a block captain to keep your street clean and social. The problem is, so little about local government is taught in school. Plus, when I learned about the federal government for the first time back in middle school, I didn't just get a diagram of the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. I also learned about the history and the debate that led us to a very intentional design. And that's one of the biggest places where local government is so different. It's been rolled into our national structure, sure, but every locality is a story that's emerged over time. Let's talk about your place for a second. Think about the place that you call home. It might be a city, a town, maybe a township. Maybe you're one of the few who live in those places called boroughs or parishes. If you're listening to this in Oregon, you guys even have 4 tiny local governments called hamlets. Or maybe you live in an unincorporated community, which is a place that exists on a map and has a name. It might even have a post office, but it's served by the county government. So you could live in a place called a town that's not really a town government. It's not self-governing at all. So why are there so many variations? Why does your local government look and operate the way it does, while a similar-sized town 2 states over operates in a completely different way? The answer is probably a culmination of many factors. The local geography and resources, population trends, businesses that gravitated to your town or left it behind long ago, state laws, and all of the big and small choices that have been made since your place was founded. The structure of the federal government was debated and decided to a large extent. But local government is a series of choices we've made and continue to make in an attempt to answer questions about how we should live together. These are questions like, how do we enforce laws and keep the peace? What services or infrastructure does it make sense to provide as a matter of public good? And don't forget, how the heck do we pay for all of these choices and decisions? Buried within those questions and choices are a lot of practical administrative challenges about how we can do these things better or more efficiently. There are also some really core philosophical questions, like what is a public good versus a private opportunity? What is fair and equitable? And does our idea of justice hold up in practice? And the history of these choices really stretches back. The concept predates our federal government. It predates the idea of a nation. It goes way back. The story actually begins over 1,000 years ago in agrarian England, just after the fall of the Roman Empire. Look, if you didn't see that sentence coming, stick with me for a minute, and I promise you're going to start to hear some familiar words. So back to England. Tribes like the Angles and the Saxons first landed there in 449 AD, and they found very little opposition waiting for them. Attila the Hun had just died, and the Romans were running home to defend their capital as their empire imploded. The land wasn't empty, but you've got to imagine as an invader, this was probably as good as it got. These tribes liked the place, and they started to put down some roots. Something like a house went up, and then another, and then eventually you had something that looked like the first settlement. Pretty soon, these tribes had settled into roughly 7 kingdoms across the area we now know as England. Now, it wasn't long after the first settlement that you had the first petty neighborhood dispute. The precise details of this first tiff are lost to history, but it probably came down to this. One neighbor probably cut down a tree that was growing in the other's yard, or he was banging out stones to repair his thatched hut at 7 in the morning while the neighbor's baby was trying to sleep. Anyhow, they needed some way to resolve these kind of conflicts and to plan for the future as a community. Heads of these tribal kingdoms at the time were more like chieftains than kings. They were leaders in war, and during times of peace, they often had the final say in matters, but they would routinely gather and listen to the wise men of the tribe before they made that decision. Early on, it was possible for them to call together everyone for a meeting, but once these communities started to grow, tiers of self-government started to sprout up. At the bottom rung, you had small groups of households called townships. A township, that's Tunscipe, was literally a hedge that surrounded the homes and farms. In addition to these townships, there were burhs or boroughs. These were more fortified, often with walls and ditches and moats. The village freemen from both of these places met regularly at gatherings. These gatherings were called the township moot. Above the township, there was this other level of moot where each town sent their 4 best men. This was called the 100. There is some dispute about whether it was called the 100 because it could support 100 warriors or consisted of 100 households, but maybe they just thought the 100 sounded really cool. So above the 100, there was one more moot. It convened just twice a year to handle legislative and judicial matters of the broadest region, which was called the Shire. The Shireage moot was like county council, with each town again sending those same 4 best men, this time to a larger convening across many hundreds. The court was presided over by the chief landowner, called the alderman. There was also an administrator called the Shire reeve, which later got shortened to sheriff, which was like the king's representative at the Shire. So think about that for a second. Over 1,000 years before the colonists set foot on North America, representative government had started to take root in England, with the township, hundred, and shire moots. Now, not that the Anglo-Saxons invented representative government. Athens and Rome had some of this figured out way before 449 AD. But unlike the centralized government of these early city-states, Anglo-Saxon tribal kingdoms were a patchwork of small, layered governments. So what happened? Why didn't they just evolve into a nation that looked a lot more democratic? Why didn't they just do America way before America was a thing? Well, first, it's really important to not over-glorify the Anglo-Saxon life or overemphasize the similarities to early colonists. Yes, the moots had important implications for our local democratic structure, but, for example, Shire courts could still democratically decide to boil someone in oil for their crimes. Keep in mind, these were still tribes held together by lineage and racial similarities. They weren't bound together by grand ideas like a Bill of Rights or a national government. But in terms of what happened, there is a pretty straightforward answer to that. That's the Normans. So when Norman bad boy William the Conqueror arrived in 1066, Billy found the Anglo-Saxon structure pretty conquerable, right? That's his name, William the Conqueror. Yeah, so he scrapped the moots and instituted manor courts to handle all of the legislative and judicial affairs of each shire. He divvied up the land to his Norman cronies in exchange for their loyalty and military support. The levels of government looked pretty similar, but the way they operated became totally centralized and top-down. Look, this is a major oversimplification, but if you ever worked at a mom-and-pop company that got bought out or put out of business by a corporate giant, the Norman conquest was a bit like that, with obviously more death and destruction. It was probably pretty awful. Self-government didn't completely die at this point, though. It found a couple of havens under the Normans. A lot of the same democratic meetings that used to happen at the township moot began moving to things called parishes, which had started to take root ever since Christianity showed up on the island around 620 AD. And remember those fortified boroughs? Well, some of those grew into bigger centers of commerce with more power, not to mention unique needs and issues. Eventually, borough freemen were able to get special permission from the king to avoid the local manor courts. These charters also gave boroughs the ability to elect a council and select an administrator to pay money directly to the king instead of going through the local sheriff. They called this administrative head of the borough council the mayor, from the French word for major. Now, at first, these councils were chosen by all of the freemen in the borough, which worth a reminder, was still far from everyone. We're just talking about landowning men here, but that was about as progressive as it got back then. Eventually, though, the power got to even their heads, and these council leaders decided it was better if they just tapped their successors rather than leave it up to a public vote. And eventually, Norman kings got wise, and they built rules into the charters that allowed them to name the people in charge and let those people name their successors. Now, it's tempting to look back on the Norman conquest and really lament the loss of a more representative system. But remember, first, boiling oil. Second, this centralization actually paved the way for a couple of things that were missing in the tribes of Anglo-Saxon England, namely the idea of a national identity and a central rule of law that could be written down, built on precedent, and applied more reliably and impartially. So this is a podcast about US local government. Why are we even bothering with England? Well, first, it explains some of the words we still use today to describe certain aspects of local government. Township, borough, county, sheriff, mayor. At the very least, that makes for great cocktail trivia, right? But more importantly, these were the kernels of local self-government and administration that the first British colonists brought with them as they set up shop in America. So how about that? Let's cross the ocean. Let's get to the start of local government in America. So as British colonists began to settle America, three distinct flavors of local government emerged pretty quickly. You had the New England flavor, the Virginia flavor, and the Mid-Atlantic twist flavor. These variations were due to differences in geography and landscape, but also the different purposes and charters each group brought with them. New England colonists were religious pilgrims, middle-class individuals with a strong community consciousness who had been granted land as individuals. Because of their shared purpose, the rocky New England soil, the cold winters, it made sense to concentrate their new settlements into compact little villages and towns like the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Local government in the Massachusetts Bay Colony started with the town meeting, which was an annual meeting of all the freemen, really similar to the English parish meeting or the moots. In between town meetings, town affairs were handled by up to 9 town selectmen who were elected at town meeting. They managed things like highway care, poor relief, tax assessment and collection, preservation of the peace, passage of town bylaws and land titles. You know, the sort of things that local government does even today. And then in contrast to the tight-knit New England settlements, Virginia was settled by upper-class individuals and entrepreneurs. They came with large land grants, often backed by big corporations like the Virginia Company of London, which sponsored the group of entrepreneurs that eventually founded Jamestown. While towns did emerge, the landscape of Virginia also lent itself to sprawling rural estates and plantations that were more distant from one another. While there were population and merchant centers like Jamestown, all of the judicial and administrative functions New England had put in the hands of town selectmen were controlled at the county level in Virginia. It made sense, right? Everything's so spread out, it wouldn't work to have a town meeting. And like their Norman cousins, these county governments also tended to be undemocratic, closed corporations, where buddy-buddy aristocrats could appoint successors. Now, between New England and Virginia, a couple of hybrids cropped up in the Mid-Atlantic settlements. New York developed this thing called a Board of Supervisors, where elected representatives from towns were sent up to serve at the county level. Pennsylvania, by contrast, didn't have many towns yet, so instead they established this system where 3 county commissioners were elected by a whole region in a popular vote. And in all of these areas, markets began to grow into true American cities. Their needs and concerns began to differ from the more rural surrounding counties and even towns. They required specialized rules and administration. State governors realized this and started issuing executive orders giving cities charters of self-government, similar to the ones Norman kings had given to boroughs back in the day. Eventually, these evolved beyond executive orders into charters that were approved by both the governor and state lawmakers. Now, despite the fact that plenty of people were living in towns and counties and cities, by the time we finally got around to writing that whole US Constitution thing, the document doesn't have much to say about local government. States have been left to more or less figure this out for themselves. So, for the purpose of this podcast, how can we possibly describe local government on a national level? Luckily, there are some commonalities, and luckier still, the US Census Bureau is required by law to take a census of all local governments every 5 years, and they attempt to classify them. So they have saved me tons of work. According to the US Census Bureau, local governments today have three things in common. First, local government needs to be a legally organized entity. It can take a cool name like the City of Buffalo or Chevy Chase, Maryland. And that entity doesn't go away when the founders die. That continues on. Second, it needs to serve the public. It needs to be accountable to it, and it also needs to be an authority to it. And third, it needs to do things that its parent government does not do. The state doesn't come and pick up my trash or fix the broken water main on my block. So it turns out, even with so many local governments in America, there are three types of places that have all of these characteristics. Those places are called counties, municipalities, and townships. Counties are the top level here. They're just under states, and they're typically big administrative subdivisions. In Louisiana, parishes are essentially the same thing, and if you're listening in Alaska, you call them boroughs. They only have the power to do what the state specifically says they have the power to do. County services vary in scope, but generally speaking, your county probably does a lot more if you live in the South or the West, and a whole lot less if you live in New England. Mid-Atlantic, your counties are somewhere in between. Now, below counties is where it gets a little trickier. Townships and municipalities are both considered a step below county government. Some states refer to their townships as legal municipalities, and other states refer to their townships as towns, and just as often, a town is actually a type of municipality, not a township, and it will absolutely drive you insane. Fortunately, our sensible friends at the Census Bureau have once again come up with a really useful definition to help tell township governments apart from municipalities. So in their eyes, a municipal government is just something that serves a specific population, concentrated in a defined boundary. The places on a map that we think of as cities, towns, villages, and yeah, even those hamlets I talked about in Oregon, when those places have a local government that is specific to their defined area, that's a municipality. You might also hear them sometimes referred to as incorporated places. Townships, on the other hand, are kind of a wild card. They might include a main street and densely populated areas that look like towns, but are actually unincorporated, meaning they don't have their own local government specific to that town. They might even have a post office, which can be really confusing. The important part is that their government boundaries aren't defined by those densely populated areas. Townships are sometimes divided up into clean box-like areas that subdivide a whole county, like Montgomery County in Pennsylvania. Or they could form a jigsaw of big and small blobs like Somerset County in New Jersey. Some townships are really active and provide a lot of the same services a big city might, like road maintenance and police departments. Others leave a lot of that to the county. But unlike counties and municipalities, which exist everywhere across the country, 30 states have no township governments at all, including the entire South and a lot of western states. In those states, you're either living in a municipality or you're served by the county. So there are a ton of little nuanced variations, but at the core, again, you have townships, municipalities, and counties. When you look at the country like that, you start to see some regional patterns. These patterns are like historical fossils. They have everything to do with the origin of local government in the colonies. Now, today, there are so many variations and shades of local government in this country, it is daunting for the average citizen to know where and how to get involved. Even if you find yourself at a neighborhood association meeting or a district attorney debate, it can feel like everyone's talking a different language. So why bother? Why not just leave it to the pros? Local administration, policies, and laws, these are all really complicated things, and you might say what we need are trained specialists, people who have devoted their lives and careers to policy, city planning, and criminal justice. And in a lot of ways, you'd be right. But we also need generalists who know a little bit about a lot of things and can connect the dots for specialists who have their heads down in the details. People who can talk about how these things affect the day-to-day lives of people in their community and who will collaborate with government or push back to change things. We need above-average citizens who care deeply about their place. For me, the most important part of looking back on how we got here is recognizing that local government didn't start as some grand plan. It's been a history of choices, theories, mistakes, power plays, as people try to figure out the best way to live together. So, what's your vision for your place? What do you love? What do you want to see change? Over the course of this series, we'll take a closer look at the working parts of local government, and I promise we will not go back to agrarian England. Offices like the district attorney, special purpose governments like school districts, and the way different cities set up mayor and council relationships, we're going to get into all of that. Along with these explainers, we're going to bring you interviews with people who are serving localities around the country. For now, though, thanks for listening and for being an above average citizen.